was kindly agreed to spend the whole period with us. But as you know, when you hold an important portfolio, there are many demands on your time, and he has been called to a meeting with the president in a few minutes. So he will be leaving if he wishes him. But we are very thankful, sir, that you spared us this time, because the objective, two objectives. One is we want to take then you can use our primary purpose. Our second purpose under the leadership of the state minister and the president. And I think in this kind of situation, the more people know, the more research is done, the more evidence is brought to bear on the subject, the better it will be for all of us. So I would, with that sort of brief introduction, I'm not going to take all of the 10 minutes that I have been given. If the minister wants to say a few words, I'll leave some time for that before he leaves. But I just want to tell you a little bit about the organization and why we are doing what we are doing. LIRNEasia was started in 2004, September. And we began as a regional research organization based in Sri Lanka, but we continually wanted to work throughout the region. So we've had major activities in India, in Nepal, in Myanmar, and as far away as in Fiji at various times. So we've always been interested in the idea of comparative analysis, of learning, taking the learnings from one developing country to another, taking the basic principles, of course. We are not saying that we have to reinvent the wheel, but the whole idea is the basic principles, the basic theories are valid all over the world, but when it comes to policy and we bring them down to the country level, we have to take the country's realities into consideration. So that's what we wanted to do. So we had a whole raft of projects lined up in September of 2004. And I think some of you may remember what happened in December of 2004. The greatest natural disaster to hit Sri Lanka hit Sri Lanka. We immediately pivoted. We didn't stop what we were doing, but we pivoted and we said, what can we do to bring our research insights and our knowledge to bear to help our country, the country that we were based in, to help our country to respond to this disaster. So for the next several years, we had a very vibrant program on disaster response, particularly early warning and risk reduction, because our comparative advantage is our familiarity and comfort level with technology. So that's what we did in the face of that particular disaster. Now, in 2000, well, I could say from 2019, thereabouts, we were expecting a disaster. But by 2022, we knew the disaster was upon us. And this was also in the same way that the tsunami was an unprecedented disaster that Sri Lanka had never experienced. This was an economic disaster, an economic crisis, the likes of which we had not experienced. I have been looking, I have an interest in history, and I have been looking to see what kind of impact we had in a crisis, and the only thing I could find was a PhD written by a gentleman called Salgado, who talked about the crisis, the Great Depression affecting Sri Lanka, and how our per capita income at that time, which was about $80, went down by about half in a period of 4 years. So it's on that scale that we were looking at this crisis. And I can't take all the credit, but I actually got a call from inside the president's office. This was in April or so, before the prime ministership changed, before the president changed, and before any of these things happened, saying, can you give us some information about social safety nets and how we can handle looking after our poor people who are going to be affected by this crisis? So we immediately put our resources, even though we had no ongoing projects, we immediately put our resources into looking at other countries' experience, the secondary analysis that had been done, the theories, the experience that had been gained in many countries, and we made that available to the government. And we were also fortunate to have some research going on the effects of COVID. This was a comparative research that involved multiple countries. So we extracted some questions and topics from that and made it available to the decision makers from that point. So we are talking about 2022, April, May, we were giving information to the government. Then our CEO, Helani, who's unfortunately not here, I think she's in Geneva or someplace. I have stopped trying to keep track of where she is. She and our Chief Operating Officer, Nilusha, who is responsible for organizing this event, got together and again repurposed some research money that we had. And they have put together a sort of a research project with the LIRNEasia signature. We are multi-method organization. We do care about and we do good quantitative research, but we also know that we can get insights from qualitative research, focus groups, and so on. So that was done in the month from October of 2022 to March of this year. So this is a very, very near snapshot of period while we were in the crisis, so to speak. And in that whole period, we were in conversation with Mr. Vijayaratna and his team, all the decision makers, and people had input, the World Bank, all these people had input into the design of the questionnaire. And that's the material that we'll be sharing today. So that's all I'm going to say in terms of an introduction. Just to let you know that I hope everybody has got this document. This document will have the agenda for today, which has a speech by the minister, but as I explained, he will not, yes, Mr. Vijayaratna will do the honors on his behalf. And we will have a presentation of the research and so on. We have some summary information in the 3 languages, official languages, also in the packet. And in terms of the media, if anybody wants to ask any questions, particularly I know that you want voice clips. I don't know if they can pull off the Tamil, but definitely the Sinhala we can pull off. You ask a question, we will answer in any language that you want, and we will answer here, we will answer on the side. So that's the introduction. Mr. Samsingha, Honorable Minister, I think we are very grateful that you graced this occasion, because I think this signifies the continuing conversation that we are having with the decision makers. And I have promised the Minister that we will give them a detailed briefing as soon as next week at your request, at your convenience. So thank you very much, sir. So then, right, come. No, I'll introduce the presenters. So we will be making, the presentation will be done by our senior research manager, Gaini Hurulle, and by our statistician, Tharaka Amrasinghe, and they will be making the presentation. It will include the findings of Isuru is also here. He's our qualits manager, but they will be making the 2 of them will be making an integrated presentation of the survey results as well as the findings of the qualitative research and some policy analysis and recommendations at the end as well. These are both most valued members of our team at LIRNEasia, and I believe your profiles are included in this. So I won't take time repeating what's already available. And I would also like to put in a plug for our website where we put everything about us, including our accounts, where we get our money. Everything that we know that you want to know about us is on our website, and their profiles are also there. So, who's going to start? Tar.
Before we get started with the event, I want to make a small announcement. So on your tables, there would be two papers in white and yellow. So I kindly request you all to fill the first one out right now before the presentation is made. So this is to make sure that everybody who is attending today benefits from the event and your knowledge is enhanced by the end of it. So fill the white form right now and the yellow form at the end of the event. And there will be trays at the back of this room where you can deposit them once the event is finished. And if you want to make additional comments, there are post-it notes and boards like at two different places. Feel free to do so as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Mer. Good morning, everyone. So as Professor Samurdhi mentioned, just to give you a brief introduction to LIRNEasia, it's a regional pro-poor market think tank working on infrastructure, policy, and regulation issues. Right? So, as Professor mentioned, Sri Lanka faced COVID crisis in 2020, and then we went into a very difficult economic crisis. So we kept hearing anecdotally how bad the situation was, and our most recent studies also provided some insights on how bad the things were. Also in parallel, the government went into a reform process and particularly focused on social welfare reforms. So we understand that when poverty levels are high, social welfare is critical to hold up the most affected groups. So the purpose of this study is to really understand what is the state of poverty and how we can improve the ongoing reform process on social safety nets. So this study is a mixed method study involving two major components. The first component is a large-scale nationally representative survey that covers all districts in Sri Lanka, of which we will draw most of the insights for this presentation. The data is representative with a margin of error of plus or minus 1.4% at national level. This was a face-to-face study. The data collection happened between August last year to March this year. We used a rigorous multi-stage cluster sampling approach to randomly select our sample of 10,000 households from 400 GN divisions, covering all districts and all localities, urban, rural, and estates. If you want more details, there will be a QR code at the end of the presentation. You can scan that, then you will lead into a very detailed method notes. The second component was a qualitative study. For this qualitative study, we talked to more than 400 people in 13 districts. We used methods like focus groups, in-depth interviews, key informant interviews, and we also went and conducted some structured observations on how people interact with public officers and officials related to social welfare programs. So we have considered three main areas for today's presentation. First, we will discuss the state of poverty in Sri Lanka. Then Gaini will discuss the state of social safety nets, the ongoing reform process, and based on this, there will be some recommendations at the end of the presentation. So we are going to start the poverty section, and for this section, we will use the poverty line defined by the Department of Census and Statistics. It is, however, purely based on expenditure. So basically, an individual spending less than 13,777 rupees per month considered as a poor individual at national level. I mean, assuming 4 members per household, this roughly translates to about 55,000 rupees per household. So with that government definition, our survey data indicates that around 7 million people in Sri Lanka are living in poverty as of 2023, which means a third of the population is below the poverty line. So this roughly translates to about 2 million families living below the poverty line. So then we looked at the last reliable government data source available on poverty, which is the Household Income and Expenditure Survey from 2019, conducted by the Department of Census and Statistics. And when we compare our data with that data point, we can see that 4 million people have fallen into poverty. So in other words, the poverty headcount ratio has doubled from 2019 to 2023. So as per our provincial level analysis, we can see the level of poverty has increased in all provinces with different levels of magnitudes. As per our sector level analysis, we can see the state sector population was worst off in 2019 with more than a third of the state sector population living under the poverty line. Right? This has worsened in 2023. Now, more than half of the estate population is living below the poverty line. Right? Also, poverty has doubled in rural areas and the poverty has tripled in urban areas. So, as per our survey data, we are seeing people are taking quite drastic steps to, just to survive on another day. Right? We observed 1/3 of the households are eating fewer meals a day. That means they are skipping meals. Another third are restricting adults' food consumption to allow their children to eat. So we spoke to Darshani from LIRNEasia, who said there was so little money on a particular day and the children were given whatever the food they had and she decided to go on hungry. And the important thing is that that is not the first time that she has done it. So then we can see more than a third of the household have sold their assets and and about half of the households have spent their saving due to the economic crisis. So we met Farzana from Jaffna, who had sold their fridge in order to find some money to buy food. So poverty has implication on education of school-age children. Our survey data shows that 6% of the households with school-age children did not send their children to the school in the last 30 days prior to the survey implementation due to this economic crisis. So we talked to Sivartham from Badulla. He said how half of the students in a nearby state sector school are not going to the school in order to find odd jobs in the area just to earn 200 rupees per day. So I'm going to stop now and invite Gaini to continue with the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tharaka. Sorry. As you all know, Sri Lanka is undergoing a series of reforms in its social safety nets. So what I'm going to do today is first talk to you about the state of social safety nets before the reform process, and then talk about the reform process and the implications of that. So just to give you some background, Sri Lanka has over 25 social assistance programs. There's a multitude of social assistance programs, but we are only going to focus on 4 that government has identified as a focal point for its reforms. And we've identified several challenges, common challenges throughout these programs, which I'm going to talk to you about. So the first challenge is poor coverage and targeting. So what we found is that coverage across all 4 programs is low, meaning that only a small portion of those who are eligible for the program receive it. So we'll focus on Samurdhi, which we are all very familiar with, and we'll see that of the 2 million families that were below the poverty line, only 32% of them received Samurdhi. So this is very concerning. If we look at this a different way, of the 1.7 million families that received Samurdhi, only 40% were poor. Of the, even amongst the poorest 10% of households, only 31% received Samurdhi. Meanwhile, of the richest 10% of the households, 4% did. So we're dealing with a misallocation of resources. So this begs the question, why? So on paper, certain schemes are only available to people who are below a certain income threshold. And many of us know that when you work in this sort of sector, in the informal sector without pay slips, this is very difficult to verify. So often officials have a high level of discretion in determining who's in and who's out, right? And unfortunately, this gives way for programs being co-opted for political gain. And this is what we saw in the case of Amaravira, who's a retired mason who we met in Polonnaruwa. He said that he only started getting Samurdhi after he started going for political rallies. And unfortunately, this is a narrative that we hear time and time again. And if one doesn't have this level of political influence, chances are that one will be on a waiting list for many years. So on average, we found that people were on waiting lists for 4 years, but we also met people who had been on these waiting lists for up to 28 years. So from the very early days of the program, they were still on the waiting list, which then brings us to our second challenge, low exit rates. And this is really the other side of the coin of the long waiting list issue. So once you get on a scheme, you're likely going to be on it for many years, if not life. So on average, recipients who we met, and representative of the population, had been on the Samurdhi scheme for over 10 years. But in this case too, there had been people who had been on it for 28 years. And the reasons for this is that there are very limited and opaque pathways to exit Samurdhi. So we've identified a few here. So when somebody in your family moves abroad, or when they obtain government employment, chances are that you move out of the program. And like in the case of entering the program, there was also quite a lot of discretion that government officials exercised to remove people from the program. And this is what we saw when we spoke to Kiribanda in Monragala. And sometimes people who had been taken off the program were able to appeal and get back in, as Kalpana from Polonnaruwa shared. So what this means is that only 17% of people who have ever received Samurdhi have exited it, unless they've passed away, of course. And this number is lower than what we see in many other programs, like in Mexico, in Bangladesh, in Zambia, and so on. Now I'll talk to you about the third big challenge that we identified, and that is inefficient delivery mechanisms. So on average, a Samurdhi recipient spent 4 hours each month collecting their benefits, 1.5 hours going back and forth from the Samurdhi bank, and then another 2.5 hours waiting at the bank to collect those benefits. And part of the reason for this long waiting hours is that there's one designated day, Samurdhi collection day, which usually means that there's a lot of congestion at this Samurdhi bank. And the systems are designed in such a way that they can't deal with large volumes of people coming in. There are very few banks that have digital systems in place. So as Sri Lanka, who we met in Colombo, told us, people move from table to table to see whether a loan has been taken, if it has been repaid, if there are arrears, and so on. And this is what really leads to the long waiting times before they can collect their benefits. So it's a long, painstaking process for many. Some say the officers are also quite disengaged, which further slows down this process. So these are just some of the challenges that people face, but what's clear is that there's a big need and opportunity for reforms. So the National Transformation Roadmap that the President presented last week highlights that social protection is one of the 4 key focus areas for government. And before COVID, we found, and the economic crisis, Sri Lanka spent less than 0.4% of its GDP on social safety nets, and this was a lot less than the peers who had similar levels of poverty. But now we can see that our expenditure on social safety nets is increasing. And we've seen more money was allocated for social safety nets in our budget, and the IMF program also requires us to spend a larger portion of money on social safety nets. So we're seeing a positive trend in this way. And then there's also this new program, Aswasuma, which I'm sure most of you have heard about. And what this program does is that it identifies beneficiaries through a multi-stage process. The first half is quite data heavy, and the second part leads more way for human intervention. We'll talk about the full process as we go along, and we'll use our research to talk about this process. And what we'll do from here on out is talk about some elements of the Aswasuma program and then provide potential recommendations based on our research. So overall, it looks like the Aswasuma program is looking to answer all the different challenges that we highlighted earlier. poor targeting, exit rates, inefficient delivery mechanisms. But there were two things that stood out for us. One is that the Aswasuma provides differentiated benefits based on the level of vulnerability. So those who are most severely poor will get 15,000 rupees, for example, while those who are deemed just vulnerable will get 5,000. So this indicates that the benefits also are guaranteed only for a certain period of time, which is quite different to what we saw where people receive it for 10 to 28 years. So these are the big things that we saw Aswasuma being quite different to what we had seen earlier in terms of Samurdhi. However, what we found is that there are certain elements of the program that are unclear, and we'll just highlight a few, and obviously we can keep this conversation going. First is whether if one person receives multiple benefits. So, for example, if someone belongs to a family that receives the transfer for the family, so the Samurdhi replacement almost, can someone in their family also receive a kidney allowance or the senior citizens program? That wasn't very clear to us. And the second part is what is the plan for reevaluation and exit from the schemes? Because the Gazette says that the transitional poor, for example, will only get benefits until the end of the year. What happens next? Are they eligible for benefits once again? Is there going to be a reevaluation before the end of the year? The public would benefit greatly if there was greater clarity on this scheme. So this is step one for us. Then let's walk through the registration process, specifically about creating awareness about it. So the government did a wide-ranging campaign in which it used newspapers, TV, SMS, loudspeakers, and so on, right, to spread awareness on the Aswasuma program. But time and time again, as we started talking to people, we saw that people were relying very heavily on government officials to give them the information that they needed. And certainly how else to act. So where do they get the registration form? Who do they hand it over? They often relied on someone to tell them what to do there. And some people, unfortunately, this means that you need to have good relations with your government officer. People who didn't have these good relations with the officials didn't sign up for the program, right? So this awareness issue was quite a challenge for some people who we met. Then there was also some misinformation from the program. So Shanti, who we met in Avisavella, is an estate worker. But she had heard that estate workers should not register for the program, so she didn't, right? So ideally, she should have been told that anyone can register, and then you have to go through the process to see whether you're eligible or not. So within the community also, once this sort of message starts going, it prevents people from getting into the program. So what we say is that first step is to reopen Aswasuma and keep it open. We understand that the registration process has closed for now, but it's important to open it because people fall into poverty at different times and they shouldn't wait for the registration process to open to get the benefits that they need. But of course, we understand that when you keep the registration process open, people will register at different times, and then we need to think about how we proceed with the rest of the process, right? So we understand that there are these practical operational challenges, but if we go back to first principles, people should be able to register for benefits when they feel they are in need. Then there's also a need to improve communications. So we're seeing at this point in time that people are relying heavily on hearing from government officials. So we'll just have to lean into that. So one way is to perhaps incentivize officials to engage in outreach beyond their normal circles. But the messaging has to be clear that all those who feel that they are in need of receiving benefits should apply. Then we move on to talking about how they registered for the program. So there was only one way to register for the program, and that was by filling out a form and then handing it over to a government official who would then pass it on to be entered into this database. However, we encountered situations where government officials collected registration forms but then chose not to process it further. So it didn't even enter the system. So the question is, how do we allow people to get directly onto the database? Because the database is definitely a step in the right direction. We needed to get there, but how do we get people to apply directly so that this disintermediation can be taken care of? So our first suggestion is to provide digitally enabled registration options. We know that 32% of the adults in poverty are internet users. So why not give them the option to apply online? Countries like India are providing this option, as are many South Asian countries. And it's very common in other parts of the world, like in Latin America. However, if we feel this is not inclusive enough, we can also explore SMS-based registration options. And we've seen that 92% of poor households own a mobile phone, and we've seen this sort of process working very well in countries like South Africa. So perhaps these sort of things can also be explored. Then we'll also talk about the fact that government is using these 22 indicators to identify those in need of benefits. And what this does is it acknowledges that income and expenditure that we spoke about earlier can't be verified in many households. So it adds other indicators that are thought to show who is poor and who is not. So this is, once again, a step in the right direction. And face-to-face surveys were used to collect data on these 22 different indicators. While we know that these surveys are resource intensive, it does allow for some level of verification, which is good. And I'll show you why this is important, because a data collector who we spoke to in Mathura said that one of the households that he had, who had applied for the program, had a vehicle parked outside when he went to enumerate. And this is one of the criteria that has been identified by government as, as one of the 22 indicators. But the man said that this was not his, and this was his neighbor's. So then the data collector went and double-checked with the Grama Niladhari, who confirmed that it was indeed the applicant's. So verifying is important to assess the truthfulness of the data provided in any sort of form. But then the question is this the only verification method that we can use? Are there any methods that are less resource intensive? So our suggestion is to integrate the safety nets database with that of other digitized databases. So for example, in the case of the vehicles that we saw earlier, it could be integrated with the vehicle registration database at the Department of Motor Traffic, because then there would be less of a need for face-to-face verification. And of course, this option is going to be a lot more viable as the digital ID program is rolled out. Then I'd like to talk about how the 22 indicators that we had gathered information on are going to be used. Right? So the government uses its data to calculate a deprivation score using a formula. And what we did is we applied this formula and identified the 2 million families that were worst off according to this deprivation score, according to our survey. And then we compared it to how people fared against the national poverty line, and who the national poverty line identified as poor. And we use the national poverty line, like Tarak mentioned, because that's a standard metric that government has used to monitor and evaluate progress of this sort of program, how poverty is doing, and so on. So now let's assume that the national poverty line captures those in poverty, in which case the Aswasuma formula identifies 53% of the people below the poverty line. This means that 1.1 million of the families of the 2 million poor families are captured, but about 940,000 families are not being captured. So then we also need to look at people above the poverty line. And then we found that a similar number of people who are above the poverty line is captured through the formula. So this is an area that we could go on talking about for quite a while, but I'll talk to you about 3 different elements of what this means, because this is also an indication of what we can do. Right? So first thing that we need to acknowledge is that this is only a part of the identification process. The government has already identified that while it works off a formula, the appeals and objections process is necessary. But what's important here is to think about whether this process is robust. Is this something, for example, are we just checking if the indicators are accurate? Are we looking to see if people could get into the program for reasons not identified in the formula? We need to make sure that people who are otherwise not captured by the formula are able to get through this. It could also be an indicator that the formula could be improved. And what we're seeing is that it's quite decent at identifying people who are under the poverty line in normal circumstances, but less so in times of crisis. Right? So then what we need to do is perhaps use the appeals and objections process as a way to learn what has and what has not been captured in the deprivation score and fine-tune it. And of course, the third element is going back to basics and back to the original question, is that is the national poverty line actually capturing people who are in poverty? Should we be looking at different types of indicators? Does it accurately capture the newly poor? Because that's the other sort of first principles metric that we need to go to in seeing whether a program is working or not. Right, next on the delivery mechanism. So in the budget speech, the government announced that the benefits would be delivered through bank accounts. These are your regulated government and private banks, the BOCs, the People's Banks, the HMBs, the commercial banks. We found that, and others of course, and we found that 60% of the poor had this type of bank account. But since there has also been talk of regulating Samurdhi banks and allowing for benefits also to be collected through the Samurdhi banks once they are regulated. So if we also bring Samurdhi banks into the fold, we find that 71% of the poor would have bank accounts. So what this means is that less people would get into the banking system for the first time. What this also means is that there are more collection points. So we've mapped out the collection points here in red, which is what you'll see on the map, versus the gray, which shows population density. So moving from a Samurdhi bank to the currently regulated banks increases the number of collection points fourfold. But you'll see that if we give both options, Samurdhi banks and the currently regulated bank branches, people will have even more collection points, which should reduce the distance that they have to travel to banks, and then of course the time they spend there. By that logic, moving towards delivering benefits through all banks is a good idea. However, this is why this regulated part is so important. Samurdhi banks, as we highlighted earlier, have a lot of underlying challenges. Low digitalization, inefficient human resources are just some. And these need to be looked at before presenting Samurdhi banks as a viable alternative in the new system when dispersing benefits. Finally, let's talk about the sustainability of these programs. As we discussed earlier, there are several questions that need to be answered on the specifics on the exit mechanisms and so on, but it does signal that graduation from social welfare assistance is a priority. So this is why it's even more important to integrate elements to facilitate graduation into the Aswasma program. So one is to provide beneficiaries more reasonable credit options, and the other is to ensure that there are capacity building programs. And these are made accessible to the beneficiaries. So elements that we saw in the Samurdhi program essentially, but improved. So ideally, we'd like to link this to the priority sectors of growth for government. We've seen entrepreneurship development and financial management training being offered in countries like Bangladesh. These are all things that we may like to follow. So I will stop here. I've spoken to you about the status of, we have spoken to you about the state of poverty, the sort of challenges that we were facing before the reform process, and then also some policy considerations on social protection delivery chain. So we're seeing a lot of good things being done through the reform process, but there's clearly room for some tinkering and improvement, which is always the case as you start on a reform process. So hopefully we can kind of continue to talk about this in the panel discussion. Thank you very much. Just for your information, our slides and other resources, including links to the live stream, press releases, speaker bios, and so on, are also available online, which you can access through this QR code. So I'll keep this up here for a moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Taraka and Gaini. Up next is to have a conversation about what these findings mean and a general conversation about the state of social safety nets and poverty in Sri Lanka. So this will be done through a panel discussion. So to moderate the panel, let me invite Dharnath Fernando, founder and CEO of Advocata, who needs no further introduction to this audience.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Till the stage gets ready, I will quickly invite our eminent panelists on stage, so then we can use the best interest of time. And first of all, thank you very much, LIRNEasia team, for presenting that solid presentation, bringing the information and all of us up to date on poverty. Our panel today is comprised of Gayani Hurulle, who is the Senior Research Manager at LIRNEasia, and Mr. Vijayaratna, who is the Chairman of the Welfare Benefits Board, Ms. Karin Fernando, who is the Team Lead Sustainable Development at SEPA, and Taraka Amarasinghe, who is the Statistician at LIRNEasia. May I kindly invite all of you on stage, and we are ready to go on questions. While you take your seats, the format is I will first ask few questions from Mr. Vijayaratna and Karin, and then rather than waiting till the end to come back to the audience, I'm going to get to the audience for the questions, providing you the opportunity to ask questions, because I am sure you will do a better job on questioning panelists than me, and then we can get the conversation around. I kindly invite all the panelists on stage, and we can get started.
Okay, when I was going through the slides, I noticed three main names. First is Kiribanda, then it's Shanti, and there was another name called Akish. So I thought even the name of the social safety nets, I mean, those three names, pretty much, no offense to the names, but also represents some sort of an evolutionary or like a time frame of where we lived and how people give names based on the generation. And I thought even the social safety net program has somewhat evolved, and you look at the names, it was earlier Jana Savia, and then it became Samurdhi, and now it has become Aswasuma. So comparing the poverty numbers, which was shocking, where 4 million people have joined or like fallen back to the poverty, and the names have changed, but the poverty numbers have increased. So in this context, Mr. Vijayaratna, I first would like to ask you, what is the reading of the situation from after seeing these numbers, and how confident are you on the reform program that has been proposed by the government, and how do you read the ground level, because you have most of the information and grassroots level information. What's your reading of the situation?
Good morning to you all. First of all, I would wish to extend my sincere thanks for LIRNEasia for conducting this timely survey and bringing down their revealings and findings, because it is very timely, because we are on the verge of issuing the eligible persons list for welfare benefit payments, so it is very timely. So if we answer to your questions, now that we have been talking about decades and decades that social safety net has not been focused, and it is not adequately coverage and not enough or not generous enough to cater the requirement of the needy people. So having understood that one, the Welfare Benefit Act was presented and passed in the Parliament in 2002. But any reason or other, the subsequent government who came to power didn't want to implement the Welfare Benefit Board Act. Ultimately, in 2019, the board was appointed, unfortunately, with 3 months running, it was again defunct. So last year, in July, after the struggle is over, the finance minister appointed the Welfare Benefit Board, and we started the work from where we stopped in 2019. Now, your finding reveals that earlier we had concentrated on identifying the poor people on means test, that means consumption, expenditure or income. In addition to that criteria, we, with the lessons learned from the globe, we decided to go for the multidimensional depreciation test. What is the difference between the type of that global accepted or emulating multidimensional one and our one is that original one, it speak about the 3 dimensions, our one 6 dimensions. And the original one speak about the 10 indices, in our one 22 indices. So therefore we have contextualized the world or global accepted multi-depreciational test into our context. I think that even though your finding reveals that the assessment covered only 53% of the poor in our program, but when we compare about the Samurdhi one, as you reveal, it was 31%. So nearly about 22% increase on the verge of starting our process. That means we can by and by improve the coverage and the target. So in this context, I think our program would be very successful one and yet to be improved with the learning we collected in the exercise of the program. Thank you.
Mr. Vijayaratna, very quick technical question. Now, this indicated that there are 22 criterion on selecting someone, whether they are going to be eligible for this Aswasuma program. So is there a chance that someone will get like the double benefit because they are in a family, there can be a kidney patient as well as someone also who is disabled. So how do you basically identify and rectify, and is there a opportunity to get, I mean, is it allowed first of all, or how does it work?
Yeah, now that in the Gazette notification published and approved by the Parliament, it contains 3 schedules. First schedule is the family base or the household base. The second schedule is individual base. It means that if the CKDU patient or the adult or the person with disability is there in the family, top up is there. That means second schedule amount will be added to that family in addition to the family base allowance for the payment.
Thank you, Mr. Vijayaratna. I'll move to Karin. Karin, what's your reaction on the situation? The government seems to be also, there was always a complaint that things are delayed, but now they are, I think, moving at some pace. What's the reaction that you're getting from the ground level? Do you think the suggested Aswasuma program addresses the poverty needs? Are they moving at rapid rate? What's your reading on the situation?
Okay. Let me just go back to your earlier question for just 1 second before I answer this one. I think the sad truth for Sri Lanka is that we were actually reducing our poverty, and now we're in a situation where the poverty rates are actually escalating, which is actually a very unfortunate situation to be in. And we are in a situation where there is new poor in areas that were actually progressive. So now we have to deal with a productive group of people who have now faced a very difficult situation. So there is a difference between people who were actually in need of support on a regular basis, and now there is a group who just need to be supported in a short period of time. So we also need to understand that the kind of support that those 2 groups need is different. So we need to also kind of think whether there is a group that needs productive support, and whether that really is a need that requires 2,500 rupees, or whether they should be supported in more entrepreneurial, productive support is a question that we need to ask. And in areas like the south, in the central areas where the jump according to the LIRNEasia report is huge, the kind of support may actually be a little bit different. So I think I would like to point towards that as something to think about. In terms of the speed, yes, I mean, this is a good thing that the change is happening. Reform was necessary. It was a long time coming. And in the way that it is moving, it is trying to address three of the big issues: inclusion, exclusion errors, the exit issue, the graduation issue, and trying to improve the efficiency. So I think the rationale behind the reforms is clear. The worry, though, is that because of external factors, the speed in which it's going may not be also allowing the incubation time that is necessary for it to put in place all the legs that is needed. So is it giving the time for the staff to be in place? For example, we know that, yes, they will go and now allow for people to, as as was described, now they will release the people who are eligible. And we know that, the idea is that no one is going to be left behind, but this is a targeted program, so people will fall. Certain people are not going to get, and they will come and object. There is an appeals process. So is the system in place to ensure that those people will be heard? Is the validation process prepared to deal with the kind of anger and stress that is going to now fall on those officers who are going to have to face that kind of outbursts in a way that is going to be there. I mean, for example, when the Southern Highway was being built and there was the compensation packages, same kind of outbursts, right? There was a compensation, but there was a lot of stress on the ground in terms of how that was implemented, and it took quite some time for that process to fall into place. So time is needed for the system to actually go into operation. And my fear is that the time needed is just not being afforded to us because the externalities are pushing us too fast. Let me also just say that in terms of the methodology, definitely the multidimensional approach, I would say, is better than a unidimensional approach. And that is probably also a time for us to think about what is a better approach for Sri Lanka. Should we still go? And there's so much criticism on using a one-dimensional approach. So yes, maybe it's time that we think about a multidimensional approach. And if we want to use it, we can't compare it against a one-dimensional approach. So if we want to monitor what is happening with the Samurdhi, with what is happening with the Asvasuma beneficiaries, then the way to measure it also should be against a multidimensional approach and not against a unidimensional approach.
Thank you, Karin. Before I move to Tharaka and Gaini, I think we'll get questions from the audience because they have gone through the numbers, they saw the survey results. So if you could please indicate that when you have a question, I'm sure there are mic bearers, they will pass the mic to you. Please make sure that keep the questions as short as possible, and then you can do a very quick introduction and then shoot the question to the fellow panelists, and then we'll try to address questions as much as possible. You can ask questions in Sinhala or English. Tamil, I'm sorry, I do not understand, but I'm sure we can figure something out. But please feel free to ask your questions in any convenience language. Over to you.
Thank you. Samantha De Silva, ex-World Bank. I think this is a very, very important topic, and I'm really glad that you have organized this. Excellent presentation, and I'm also very impressed with the knowledge that Mr. Wijeratne is bringing to the table. But in a sense, I want to say that targeting for safety nets is the easy part. We have done this in many countries across the globe, from Tanzania to Mongolia to Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, etc. Targeting is also the most formula-based. Far more important for me personally is the institutional arrangements for delivery of these programs. That's where you get stuck. We have many laws governing social protection from 1901. And these are all, they are not, they're not rationalized. They counteract each other. Various institutional arrangements have been put in place to deliver these various programs, from Samurdhi to all of the different education related cash transfers, etc., etc. So I would like to hear from this panel what exactly will happen as to the institutional arrangements, the policies governing safety nets, and the regulations governing safety nets, because they are just as important as getting the targeting right. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I think we can get one more question and then I'll open it for panel. Yes, we have a question over there. Yes.
Am I going?
Yes, Umesh.
Hello.
I'll come to first Umesh and then to you, Dr. Jiva.
Actually, I was just going to follow up on what Samantha said.
Okay. Shall I quickly go back to Umesh and come back to you? Yes.
Hi, I'm Umesh from University of Colombo. I have a couple of questions to Welfare Benefit Board Chairman. First is that this is a newly set up institution. I understand the act was there, but now it's sort of fresh, right? So how about the capacity there to carry out this big reform that we are talking about, because we are shifting from Samurdhi to direct cash transfer? And do you think that there's sufficient budget? I understand this may be a difficult question to answer, but is there enough capacity, and what can the government do to increase that? That's the first part. The second part is, what exactly is going to happen for the kind of other benefits, the non-cash benefits that the Samurdhi beneficiary is receiving? When I say non-cash, I mean they do get sometimes these funeral allowances. When a kid get married, they get allowances. So are there any plan to address those? Because when the direct cash transfer is provided, they will get 5,000 or 7,500 or whatever the number. But with what would happen to those other benefits that they are getting? Thank you.
Thank you, Umesh. Dr. Jiva?
Yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to, again, talking about the implementation arrangements, what sort of transparency and accountability systems have you put in, especially in the in the districts and with the district secretaries and the GN people? Because I was in Jaffna recently, and just talking to some of the development officers, they have no idea on these 22 indicators, that we're talking about today. They have no understanding of what it means even to measure poverty. And they are still getting lists unfortunately, from the local politicians saying that these people need to be in it. So I just want to see what sort of systems the government is actually putting in place to actually make sure that there is an open and transparent. The other question I had, last question, is on this, given the fact that the tea estate have had one of the largest poverty issues, how are we sort of engaging with the private sector that owns, the tea estate, the tea industry, for example? How are we going to try and engage with them to make sure that, these are the productive people and who provide a lot of the resources for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jiva. Please keep your questions ready. I'll quickly come to Mr. Vijayaratna and our fellow panelists and get back to, again, open it for the questioning round. Ms. Vijayaratna, you have a few more questions. I think we can couple the first one and the third one, the targeting and the institution structure and the transparency and the accountability measures that has been taken. And then we can come to the capacity to implement and the non-cash benefits to address on the second round.
Right. Yeah. Now that let me cited in my memory the preamble of the Welfare Benefit Act in order to answer your questions. That in future, almost all welfare benefit payment scheme will be brought under the umbrella of the WBB, and the preamble says that the selection or identifying the eligible persons has to be done through a very transparent process, and do the payment accordingly. So that is the future of the almost all welfare benefit payment schemes. Already that education ministry wanted to utilize our social registry to be published in near future to distribute their school uniforms and the shoes and the books. In addition to that, our print media and the electronic media especially wanted to utilize our social registry in order to implement their CSR programs. And what is our strength is that we utilize the government agent and the divisional secretariat as our focal nodes in the periphery. So we don't have our own staff, but the government is enormous resources are there as far as human is concerned. So we have been deputized by the various, especially public administration ministry, and delegated and assigned some sort of officials to the divisional secretariat, and they identified that they are carried out our tasks. In that way, we have organized our institutional arrangement, and in future there will be no plethora of institutions doing the same thing or distributing the welfare benefits allowances, and whole institution would be the WBB.
Mr. Vijayaratna, just to quick sub-question. Now, on the research, there was a case study saying that this one family member actually tried to assault that person if they were eliminated from the program. While I respect your answer, these Samurdhi Niladaris, they are from the same locality. So how do you avoid that? You are still giving the discretionary power to select whether someone is going to, of course with those 22 criterion, but still that risk factor is there because it came out very strong. I mean, there's one particular case study in the survey. Is there a remedial method to, because yours, from what I understood, you're still trying to implement it through the divisional secretariat and using the government, the same government infrastructure. That is, we all know, again, politically appointed, and there's political element in it. So would this be a replication of the same thing with a different name and with more structures? How do you address that problem? How do you avoid that?
Yeah, we started our program with enormous challenges. Now that especially I want to mention that some officials and the union came forward and asked that we have to amend the section 21 and 22 of the Act. So we consulted them and we had a round of discussions to get their support to implement our program. But in my capacity, the Secretary's capacity, Honorable State Minister's capacity, and the President Secretary's capacity, we held the round of discussions. It was failed. So they wanted to, I think some officials wanted to make unsuccessful of implementing this program, or the starting of this program has to be took away. So therefore, I think that is some sort of linkage between that protest and the objection to the level of assault. So that is as I presume, that would be a one cause for that objection or the assault. So in future, anyhow, that we have by now, our progress is 86% of the progress we have achieved, and with this successful implementation, they will learn a lesson that anyhow we are implementing this program. They have to adapt and adopt and emulate the program in future. So therefore, I think repercussion will be somewhat different, and they will support ultimately because that government wanted to do, and government would do it, and then the result is that we have to emulate or accept the program. So in future, with that success, they will support us.
I'll come to the tea estate and the engaging private sector question later, but Gaini, I want to ask you, there was this discussion whether these 22 indicators whether it's too complicated. And there were also discussions on taking one singular or like one or two, like a simplified indicator. There has been suggestions on the electricity usage. There has to been multiple parameters. So how do you see it? I mean, from the research, from going through the data, what is your recommendation, whether it's 22 indicators, or do you see a better matrix to evaluate who would be eligible for this Aswasuma program?
Thanks, Lana. So this is also a question that we were trying to answer time and time again. And what Tharaka and I did was that we went back to the indicators and we looked at, is there any single indicator that works best, right? So we looked at each of these 22 indicators and looked to see which correctly identified the poor, but then also solve these exclusion and inclusion errors, right? So what we found is that you often have to balance between either correctly identifying the poor versus getting rid of the people who are incorrectly there, right? So that's the challenge that you have to face. On this electricity indicator, actually we had done an analysis. I'll pull up a slide and then talk you through it. Give me one moment.
Can we, yes, get the slides on the screen, please?
Walk you through this one, because this was a question that we saw being discussed in many policy circles, in Parliament and so on, right? So we wanted to see what our data said about this. So just to give anyone here who doesn't have context on this, electricity, the proposed suggestion is that you used one single indicator of the 22 that has been identified by government to identify the poor, right? And the particular indicator that we looked at is electricity consumption, looking at whether a household consumes less than 60 kilowatt hours a month. So the logic behind that is if they consume less than that amount, that they should be in the program. If not, they should be sort of taken out. So there are some benefits of using electricity consumption as an indicator, right? And if you go through this process, you'll see that it's easy to measure, the data is available, it's updated frequently, and so on. But there are also some setbacks. So what we've done over here is that we've compared the electricity consumption as one indicator with the deprivation score, which the government is using right now. And we've tried to map out the extent to which the criteria is met across different expenditure deciles, right? So in both of these, what we want to do, Okay, so what we want to do is to make sure that for the poorest households, that you capture as many households as possible, right? But then what you also want to do at the other end of the spectrum is to reduce the number of rich households, right? So what we've done is compare the two. So if you look at electricity consumption, which is what you see in red, you'll see that it's marginally better at identifying the poor households, right? You'll see an 88% versus a 73%. But at the other end of the spectrum, you see that it also is less good at taking out the rich households. So these are the policy decisions that you have to weigh against to see which one you want to prioritize, right? And then from a practical perspective, then what this also means is you need to think of what happens next in the next stage of the process. So in the appeals and objections process, for example. So what you'll see is that in this case, if you go with the electricity consumption indicator, you need to make sure that the objections process works out very well, right? Because it brings in more people who shouldn't be in there. However, if you go with the deprivation score, you need to make sure that your appeals process works much better, right? So we look at this process together, but in the end, it's one or the other that you have to prioritize. So even going forward in making a policy decision, what we'd encourage in picking one of the two is to see, even now we're going to implement this deprivation score method, right? Once we go to the appeals process, look to see, are people appealing more, are people objecting more, right? If you find that people are appealing more, maybe the deprivation score would work better. But if you do find that people are objecting more, what we could look at is the electricity consumption indicator, because of course there are also other benefits. So it's not a one and done deal. There are obviously different elements that we have to weigh against, look at the process more holistically, and then decide what will work best for Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Gaini. Before I come to you, I will quickly also move to Taraka. Taraka, just wanted to ask you, because if I remember right, the exit rate is about, I think, 17% from the Samurdhi program. So do you have any suggestions to make sure that those who basically upgrade through the income to exit from the program? Because what we have seen earlier was every politician comes and says, look, we have increased the number of Samurdhi beneficiaries, which is actually in a way indicating that we have more, and we have pretty much generated poverty. So what's the incentive for someone who is getting Samurdhi or like the Aswasuma to exit from that? And do you have any suggestions, recommendations, any data points that you have to highlight from the numbers that you have gone through?
Not directly from our survey, but like Gaini have come in, please, right? So, I mean, we compared our, I mean, we can show the map, right?
You might have to get from the main screen, yes. So till Taraka gets his slides, I will also want to come back to on the distribution issue as well. Like you have shown in a map, now it's through Samurdhi banks, but what if we also expand the scope with the other banks? But let's come to that later. Taraka, are you ready with the slides? Yes.
Yeah. Here you can see how the exit rates are from other countries, right? Countries in similar countries and across the globe, right? So I think we have to look at what works best from these programs and adopt the good things from this program into our Aswasuma program. Then I think we will be able to bring that 17 number higher. Yeah.
Do you have any, or Gaini can jump in, because I see that Mexico and Colombia, they have very high exit rates, but our one is pretty much seems to be the lowest. So have you studied like what are they doing to keep this exit rate high, whether it's a political gimmick, or is it really there's some system in place for this high number of exit rate?
Shall I jump in, Taraka? Yeah. So I mean, all these different programs use very different methods, right? But I'll talk about the Bangladesh program, which we did study. And what Bangladesh does is there's government-run programs, but they also have a lot of support from non-governmental sectors, right? They work together quite a lot, and that's also what does help them. There's a lot of monitoring and evaluation that the NGOs do, and then they build the capacity of government. So that always helps, and you see that bleeds through into how government implements as well. But what we've seen in Bangladesh working, which is actually where we got some of our recommendations as well, is that they focus on entrepreneurship. So they not only focus on livelihood development, they really help people stand on their own 2 feet again, come up with their own businesses. So then you bring that entrepreneurial spirit into people, and then they are able to sustain themselves. The other big thing that they focus on is financial management, right? So after you do, you are able to generate your income streams, how do you manage it well? And that's the other thing that, I mean, Sri Lanka broadly, all of us have sort of faced, right? This is an issue that we see time and time again across our population. So you see that it's integrated into the welfare graduation process, and that has also seemingly helped these people.
Thank you, Taraka. Thank you, Gaini. I think we can go back to questions. Yes, I can see so many hands raised, but we'll give for the media personnel also. Shehan, yes. Can we give the audio access to that mic? Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Dhananath. by looking at the presentation, where I found two questions, very interesting findings, Gayani, at your presentation. Now, you said that some did not actually have not even registered with the assessment program due to the lack of knowledge, lack of awareness. Now, this is very alarming. And Mr. Vijayaratna, now also in the recommendation in the research, they recommend that is there any room for reopening the registration or keep the registration on? Because even what I have found that some people, very needy people, have not even registered with the program. So do you have any corridor of opportunity to reopen the registration process once again? Because it feels, I also feel that what the reports that we some have got have not registered with the assessment program. That question is from Mr. Vijayaratna. The secondly, in this report, which I actually struck my mind, is a very alarming thing, which says that, I think if I'm correct, 6% of the household that you all have sort of surveyed for the last 30 days that they have not sent their children to school. Now, this is an alarming factor. It seems that the more we go to poverty, the people are not sending their children to schools, maybe because they can't afford to send, and they know they can't even feed their children. It seems that we are heading for more illiteracy society, illiterate society, and I think we need to address that as well. Now, how are we going to tackle that? Because I also know that some people actually send their children because if you give the midday meal, they make it a point, an incentive to send their children to school. But unfortunately, even this midday meal program also has stopped. Now, this is also adding to the poverty, because our future will have an illiterate society. So how are we going to address this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jehan. Before we'll take that question, I will quickly allow you to answer first question, but before you answer, I should just, not a joke, but this question will go on headlines, and most likely when you say, depending on the answer, if it's reopened, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people in the queues again to re-register. So just wanted to give that alarm, and you can answer the two questions.
Yeah, Astasuma Welfare Benefit Scheme is actually the circular journey, but to start, we have to have some sort of linear start, that means start and the end. So our start was there in last August, and by July, we anticipate to make the first payment. After that, it starts the circular journey. Then that means we open up for those who left behind to apply for the program. So that program is not calling application, but we open up our web, and web solution is there for applications, and self-enumeration and fill in the digital form by the applicant or by the acquainted person to the system. And then automatically they have to fill up the form, and self-enumeration is going on. After that, the list of eligible persons will be included into the main registry. That is the answer for first question.
Yes, the second question is, I think, pretty much on Gayani, this 6% school children drop out when the time that you conducted the survey, that the 30 days before the survey was conducted. Do you want to respond to that, Gayani?
Sure. I mean, this is a number that we also found quite concerning, because this translated to about at least 200,000 children, right? Because so this is a big number when we look at our population. So we found this quite concerning. Shehan's absolutely right in that, see, it's a tough process, right? So we saw almost conflicting situations from different types of households. So we met people who said, I am sending my children to school, and it's a plus that they are getting a midday meal, right? So they said at least they will get one nutritious meal a day, because we can't afford to give them a nutritious meal at home. So we definitely see that as well. But unfortunately, like Shehan correctly mentioned, there are some schools that don't give this, right? So because of that inequality, it further sort of exacerbates the people who are left behind. and then means that they will drop out of school and then possibly have longer term consequences throughout their life. So this is a challenge, and so you can see inbuilt sort of inequalities further exacerbating, right? And it's also quite interesting and quite sad because Sri Lanka historically is not a country where you found that people didn't send their children to school, right? There has always been a push to send children to school. We value education, but unfortunately at times like this, people just can't afford to send their children to school. They say the cost of exercise books is too high. They say that we've met people who said the teachers keep asking for exercise books, but new exercise books, we can't afford that, so we take pages from the old exercise books and put it together and then give it back to the child to take to school. So this is the challenge that we're facing. It's not something that Sri Lanka has faced earlier, but unfortunately as a sort of, it's a symptom of the large economic crisis that we're facing.
Thank you, Gani. Let's get more questions. I think, yes. The lady next, yes, in the same table, yes. And we have another question at the corner, but first we'll take this question, yes.
Thank you. This is Maitri from Villidu. My question is to the chairman of the Welfare Benefits Board. Taking in the first question that I have is on the criteria for selection. And when it comes to definitions of persons, I think in Sri Lanka we have witnessed, and there are studies to